In today's class, we will learn about nesting of for loops or nested for loops. We are already aware of the features of a loop, and they are setting and initializing a counter, executing the statements in the body of the loop, testing a specified condition for execution of the loop or termination of the loop, and incrementing or decrementing the counter value. By now, we already know that there are three types of loops in C or C programming language. They are for loop, while loop, and do loop. And we are already familiar with their corresponding syntax and their differences because we have already learned all those things in our last class. In today's class, we will mainly focus on for loop. We know that in case of for loop, this parameter signifies that this is the counter and this is the initialization of the counter value. So this n is equal to 1 covers the first feature, setting and initializing a counter. Now we have n less than equal to 10, which is the specified condition for execution of the loop. We here decide that whether to repeat that body of the loop or to terminate that loop. Now the third parameter here n plus plus, that means n is equal to n plus 1. This is actually where we are incrementing the counter value. But as I said in my last class, that it's not mandatory that we will be always incrementing the counter value. No, if we start from the maximum value, then as per the requirement we can also decrement the counter value. And this is the body of the loop which covers our second feature. Now today's class is about nesting of for loops. In our previous classes, we have seen the nesting of if statements. So there we have learned that one if statement under another if statement. So the same logic goes here also. One for loop under another for loop. We will see a small example little later. Here we will focus on the syntax part. Here in the first two lines we have dots. They signify these are the lines of codes which are part of the program, but they are not part of any of these for loops. Now we have this for statements which signifies that this is the beginning of a for loop, and then as per the features of for loop we have all these parameters and their corresponding value. Then we have this opening brace, and of this opening brace we have a corresponding closing brace as well. So within this opening brace and this closing brace, whatever we will be writing here, that will be the part of this for loop. And then we have a few lines which are executable in nature, and they are also part of this for loop. And then we have another for statement. So that signifies that we have another for loop within the first for loop. And as per the features of for loop, again within this opening parenthesis and closing parenthesis, we have all these parameters and their corresponding values. After this for statement, within this opening brace and closing brace, whatever statements we have, they are actually part of this for loop, a second for loop. And after this closing brace, whatever lines of codes we have here, they are not part of the second for loop, rather they are the part of the first for loop. And after this closing brace, whatever executable statements or lines of codes here we have, they are not part of any of the for loops, but they are the part of the program. The for loop that we have inside of another for loop, that is referred as inner for loop, and the for loop that we have outside of another for loop, that we refer as outer for loop. And one important thing that we should be very careful of, that is a good indentation and good alignment. So if you focus on the outer for loop, as you can see here, whatever statements we have written here as part of the outer for loop, they maintain a good gap or good indentation with the for statement, and all these statements are properly aligned. And also as part of inner for loop, whatever statements we have written here, they also maintain a good indentation with the for statement. Now how these two for loops will work? When the program control after executing all these lines will come here at the outer for statement, then this counter will be initialized with this value 1, and then it will check whether I is less than 20 or not. Since I is 1, so 1 is less than 20, so it will decide to execute the body of the loop. It will not terminate the loop. So the program control will come here, and after executing all these lines, then it will get the second for statement, where it will set this counter as 1 and then it will check for whether that j value, that counter value, is less than equal to 5 or not. Since j is equal to 1, that is less than 5, so it will come inside that inner for loop and whatever statements we have, they will be executed. And then what will happen? Will it execute all these lines that we have after this closing brace? This will not execute these two lines, rather it will go back to the inner for statement and there it will increment the counter value by 1. So this time the value of j will be 2 and that is still less than 5. So it will again execute the lines or the statements that we have as body of the inner for loop, and then again it will go back to the for statement and it will increment the counter value, and this process will be continued unless the j value is greater than 5, because here the condition of execution is j is less than equal to 5. So till the moment when j is equal to 5, this body of the loop will be repeated, and once the j value is 6, then this body of the inner for loop or this inner for loop will be terminated and these two lines will be now executed. Now where the program control will go? Will it come out of the outer for loop and will it execute these two lines or whatever lines we have after this closing brace? No. Since the execution of the outer for loop is not yet complete, so when this inner for loop is terminated for a particular value of this I which we set initially as 1, then the program control after executing these two lines will go back to the outer for loop or outer for statement. There the value of this counter I will be incremented by 1. So this time the value of I will be 2. Now it will check for the condition whether it will execute further the body of that outer for loop or not. Since I is 2, 2 is less than 20, so the control will come again inside that outer for loop. It will execute these two lines and again it will execute the inner for statement, and this time it will start this inner for loop afresh. So there again the counter j will be set as 1 and then again it will execute this body for which value of I? For I is equal to 2. So initially for I is equal to 1, the value of j was iterated from j1 to 5, and this time once that loop was terminated, now we have incremented the value of I from 1 to 2, and for that value of I is equal to 2, again the inner loop will be repeated from j is equal to 1 to 5, and once that condition of termination is met, means when the j will become 6, again this inner for loop will be terminated, and then again the program control after executing these two lines will go back to the outer for statement, and there I will be again incremented by 1. So this time I will become 3 and 3 is less than 20, so again the body of this outer for loop will be executed, and again this inner for loop is part of that body, so again inner for loop will be repeated, and this way this outer for loop will execute it till which value? Till I is equal to 19. So once that condition is exceeded, means when I becomes 20, the body of this outer for loop will not be executed because that doesn't satisfy the condition. So the outer for loop now will be terminated and the program control will come straight forward to these lines which are not part of any of those for loops. So this is how it happens, it works in case of nested for loops. Now we will see a small program where we have this multiplication table where we have rows from 1 to 10 and we have taken columns from 1 to 5. So for each row the column value will be multiplied. So 1 to 1 1, 1 multiplied by 2 2, 1 multiplied by 3 and so on. Now once that calculation is done and that printing is done, then we will go to the next row. So here the next row value is 2 and again we will repeat the column values from 1 to 5. So 2 ones are 2, 2 twos are 4 and 2 twos are 3, and that way it will continue. And then once that line, that calculation of the second row and that printing is complete, then we will go to the next row. So next row value is 3 and again we will repeat the column values from 1 to 5, and accordingly we will do the multiplication and then accordingly we will print. So this logic we need to incorporate in our C programs, and this time we will be implementing by using nested for loop. So by now we already know how this syntax works and how we write nested for loops. So these two dotted lines signify that we may have other lines also before the for statement works. And after that for statement, also after this closing brace, again we have a few lines of codes in that program. We will focus mainly on the nested for part. So this is the outer for loop. As you know, here we have chosen the row number as the counter of our outer for loop. So first we will fix on row, and for each row we will iterate the column values from initial value to the final value. We will complete the multiplication and printing, and then we will change the row number. So from 1 to, then we will go to the 2, from 2 to we'll go to 3. This way it will happen. So the counter for row number is row here, and definitely the initial value is 1 as per this table. So here row is equal to 1. Then the condition for execution of the loop, row is less than equal to row max, and as per our requirement we will fix this value. Here for maximum value we have not hard coded any value here, rather we have used a symbolic constant. The concept of symbolic constant and its declaration part that we are already familiar with. This is the incrementing part, and then inside that outer for loop we have inner for loop, and for inner for loop column is the parameter. So here the counter is call or for column number, and initial value is 1 as we know here, as you can see from this multiplication table. And the final value, for final value we have again taken a symbolic constant, and then we are incrementing that counter. And this is the main logic that we have written inside the inner for loop. So logic is simple. We are just multiplying the row number and column number, and y is the output variable. Row, col, y, this all these variables should be declared beforehand, and then we have this printf statement here where we are printing the final product. So how it is happening? Now when the program control will come here, that will set this counter value row as 1. So the program control now will come here, row value is 1, and then it will check for this condition. So 1 is less than, suppose row max was set as 10, that symbolic constant value. So 1 is less than 10. So the control will come here in this inner for statement. Here we have again a counter call which signifies, as I said, the column number. So initial column number, first column number is 1, so that has been set. So now the row number 1 and column number 1, again it will check for execution of this inner loop. So column is 1 and that is less than, here the maximum value is 5. Now it will come inside the body of this inner for loop. So row number is 1, column number is 1, so 1 multiplied by 1, here the output variable will be 1, and that will be printed. And after printing, where the control will go? Will it come out of this inner for loop? No, because the condition of termination of the inner for loop, that is not yet checked or satisfied. So it will go back to the inner for loop and it will increment this counter value call by 1. So this time column value will be 2. So now row is 1 and column is 2. Those two values will be multiplied and that will be saved in the output variable, and that value will be true, and accordingly it will be printed. And again the control will go back to the inner for statement. This time the value of call will be 3, then it will be 4, then it will be 5. 5 is still equal to 5, so that will be repeated, the execution of body of that inner for loop. And now again it will come back to this inner for statement. Counter call will be 6. So 6 is more than 5, so this inner for loop, that will be terminated. And now the control will come here. Here we have a printf statement which prints a new line. Why new line? Because after we have printed all these values, now we will go to the next row, and for printing those values for the next row, those multiplication results, we will be printing in the next line, and that's why we have used here a new line character. So now here we will be printing, and for that we need to set the row value 2. So the program control will go back to the outer for loop, and that row, this counter value will be incremented by 1 as per this parameter, and then it will check for execution or continuation of that body of the outer for loop. Since row value is 2 and row max is 10, that means it will be that body of the outer for loop will be repeated. So again the control will come to the inner for loop, and this inner for loop again will start afresh. So call will be initialized to 1, and as it was repeated for row value 1, now for row value 2 also it will repeat 5 times. So for the first time, row value will be 2 and now column value will be 1. So 2 multiplied by 1, that value will be 2. And again it will go back to it will repeat the inner for loop. This time column value will be 2. So y will be 2 multiplied by 2. So this will be 4. And accordingly it will be repeated 5 times. And when call value will become 6, then this inner loop will be terminated. And then the program control, after going to the next line, it will come back to the outer for loop. This variable, this counter will be incremented by 1. That value now will be 3. And since 3 is less than 10, so again it will repeat the inner for loop. And this way the outer for loop will repeat till which value? Unless the row, this counter value becomes 11. Because this maximum value is 10. So when it will exceed that value, because here we have less than equal to row max, that condition. So when row, this counter or this variable will become 11, the outer for loop will be terminated and program control will come here. And whatever lines we have now as part of that program, they will be executed. So this is how the nesting of for loops works. So this is how we print the multiplication table by using nested for loops. I hope the logic of nesting of for loops is clear now. See you in the next class with some new topic. Till then, stay tuned. Thank you.